Tuesday evening, October 1954. A house in Ohio. The table is set before anyone asks. 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 sets of silverware. The bread basket is already there. The butter dish is already there. The pitcher of water is already there. The food is not on the table yet. The food does not come to the table until everyone is seated. That detail, the food arriving after the family, not before, is the first of 15 traditions I want to talk about tonight. Because every single one of them was standard practice in 1954. And almost all of them are gone. Not abandoned because they stopped working, just gone. Quietly, one at a time. Until the table that existed in 1954 was replaced by something so different that the women who set those tables every night would not have recognized what we call dinner. Think about the last family dinner you sat down to. Not a holiday dinner, not a special occasion. A regular Tuesday night dinner. Was the table set before the food arrived? Did everyone sit down at the same time? Was there a moment, any moment, before the first bite, when the meal was formally acknowledged to be beginning? Did everyone eat the same thing? Did the dishes go to the sink before anyone left the room? For most American families today, the answer to most of those questions is no. Not because anyone decided those things should stop, because they stopped without anyone deciding. In 1954, the answer to every one of those questions was yes. Not in every household, not perfectly, not without exception, but as the expected norm, as the standard from which deviation required explanation. 15 traditions, each one gone, each one worth understanding. Before we go through all 15, subscribe and leave a like. I put out a new video every day about the forgotten food traditions and household habits of American grandmothers. Hit the bell so you don't miss anything. Now, let's set the table. Tradition 15. The table was always fully set before the meal began. Not kind of set, fully set. Every place had a plate. Every plate had silverware on both sides, fork on the left, knife and spoon on the right. Every place had a glass already filled with water. The bread basket was on the table. The butter was on the table. The salt and pepper were on the table. All of this happened before the food was ready and before anyone sat down. The setting of the table was a separate act from the cooking of the meal, performed by whoever was assigned to it that week, which rotated among the children as they got old enough to be responsible for it. The fully set table communicated something before anyone touched the food. It said, "This meal was prepared for you." Someone thought about this before you arrived. You are expected, and you are welcome. The modern table is set with whatever is available when the food arrives, often while the food is cooling on the counter. The message is different. Not worse necessarily, just different. The care of the full setting was visible, and visible care changes the experience of the meal. Tradition 14. Nobody ate until everyone was seated. This sounds obvious. It was not optional. The food was on the table. The smell was in the room. The children were hungry. None of it mattered. Nobody picked up a fork until everyone was in their chair. In religious households, this waited for grace. In secular ones, it waited for the signal. The father nodding or saying, "Let's eat." The mother sitting down after bringing the last dish from the kitchen. The specific signal varied. The waiting did not. This tradition is connected to the one that follows it, but it is worth noting on its own. The act of waiting, of not eating simply because the food is present and you are hungry, is a practice that builds a specific relationship with food. The relationship of, I eat when it is time to eat, not when I want to eat. The food does not command me. The meal structure does. This sounds small. It is not small when you accumulate it over 3 meals a day for a childhood. The adult who grew up waiting until everyone was seated has a different relationship with the impulse to eat than the adult who grew up eating whenever the food was available. Tradition 13. Grace, or a moment of acknowledgement before the first bite. Religious households said grace. Not every household was religious, but even in secular households, there was almost universally some moment, brief, sometimes barely ceremonial, between everyone being seated and the first fork moving. A nod, a word, a few seconds of collective stillness that separated the transition from waiting to eating. I have written about the physiology of this in earlier videos on this channel. The brief pause before eating has a measurable effect on the pace of the first few minutes of a meal and on the body's ability to register satiety before overeating occurs. The 1954 family was not pausing for physiological reasons. They were pausing because it was what you did. The effect was the same. The modern meal begins when the food is available and the person is in front of it. There is no pause. There is no transition. There is no collective acknowledgement that a meal is beginning. The eating starts at the same moment as the access to food. The physiological consequence of this, faster eating, delayed satiety signaling, higher caloric intake before fullness registers, is documented in the research. The 1954 tradition of the pause was not designed to address this. It just did. Tradition 12. Everyone ate the same thing. One meal, on the table, for everyone. Not a version for the child who didn't like green beans. Not an alternative protein for the teenager in a phase. Not a separate dish for the person watching their weight. One meal, made by one person, eaten by everyone at the table. This tradition has almost completely disappeared from the American family dinner, and its disappearance has had consequences that extend beyond the practical inconvenience of cooking multiple versions of dinner. When everyone eats the same thing, the meal is a shared experience. Everyone has the same information about what they just ate. Everyone can talk about it. What was good? What was different from last time? Where the recipe came from? The food is a common subject because it is a common experience. When people at the same table eat different things, the meal is a collection of individual experiences happening simultaneously. Less shared, less connected. The shift happened partly because processed food made individual portions practical, and partly because the cultural narrative around food shifted from "you eat what is provided" to "you eat what you prefer." Neither shift was inevitable. Both had consequences that were not anticipated at the time. Tradition 11. Bread was on the table for every meal. Not as an appetizer, not as a course, as infrastructure. A basket of sliced bread, sometimes homemade, usually store-bought by the 1950s, always real bread made from actual flour, was on the table before anyone sat down, and stayed there through the entire meal. The bread served as an extender for protein. You needed less of the expensive item when bread was available. An absorber of liquids. The bread cleaned the plate so nothing was wasted. A final course for anyone still hungry after the main food was gone. And a vehicle for the butter that was also always on the table. The bread basket has largely disappeared from the American family dinner table, partly because of the low-carbohydrate dietary movements that demonized bread from the 1990s onward. partly because store-bought bread became a product with a long ingredient list of preservatives and additives that made putting it on the table feel less wholesome than it once had. Partly because the role the bread was playing, extender, absorber, final course, went unrecognized as a role, and the bread was seen only as carbohydrate rather than as a functional component of a complete meal system. The bread basket was not decorative. It was working. Tradition 10. The pitcher of water was on the table, not soda. A ceramic or glass pitcher. Water. Poured into glasses before anyone sat down. Refilled as needed through the meal. Not soda. Not juice. Not individual bottles of flavored water. Water. This was not a health choice in the conscious modern sense. It was simply what was on the table because water was free and available, and because the idea of serving sugar-sweetened beverages at every family dinner had not yet occurred to anyone as a norm. The per capita consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages in the United States in 1954 was a fraction of what it became by the 1980s. The growth of the soft drink industry through the 1960s and 1970s, and the placement of vending machines in schools and workplaces through those decades, normalized sugar consumption in liquid form in ways that had not existed before. The pitcher of water on the 1954 table was replaced, first by soda on special occasions, then by soda regularly, then by individual cans and bottles as the default. The caloric and sugar content of the American family dinner increased significantly through this transition, without anyone making a conscious decision to increase it. The pitcher of water required nothing. It cost nothing. It delivered hydration without anything else. The norm it represented, that what you drink at dinner is water, is recoverable. But it requires a conscious decision now, rather than being the default, which is a significant change from the era when it required no decision at all. Tradition 9. Leftovers had a plan before they went in the refrigerator. Nothing went into the refrigerator without an assigned destination. The pot roast that came off the table on Sunday went into the refrigerator as Monday's hash. Not as leftovers that might get eaten, as Monday's hash. The extra mashed potatoes were tomorrow's potato croquettes. The vegetable broth from the pot roast was the base of Tuesday's soup. The plan was not written down. It was held in the cook's head as part of the ongoing kitchen management that her week ran on. The refrigerator was an intermediate stage in a planned sequence, not a storage space for food that might be eaten before it went bad. The USDA currently estimates that American households waste between 30 and 40% of the food they purchase. The 1954 household, operating on a budget that left no margin for waste, discarded almost nothing. The planning was not a virtue, it was a necessity. But it produced a relationship with food. Every ingredient has a next purpose. Nothing leaves the kitchen until it is given everything it has. That has essentially no equivalent in modern food culture. The refrigerator went from being a stage in a sequence to being a holding space where food waits to be eaten or thrown away. The plan disappeared when the budget loosened enough that waste became affordable. Tradition 8. The cook did not sit down last and get up first. This one is more complicated than the others, and it requires some honest acknowledgement. The 1954 family dinner ran on the labor of one person, almost always the mother, who had been working since morning and would continue working after the meal was over. The tradition itself was not equitable in its distribution, but within the tradition as it existed, there was a specific norm. The cook was served first, sat down with everyone else, and was not expected to jump up and retrieve forgotten items or respond to requests during the meal. The meal was ready when it was brought to the table. If something was forgotten, it stayed forgotten, or it was retrieved by whoever noticed it was missing. The cook had done the work. The meal was her work, and it was complete when it reached the table. The modern family dinner often has the person who cooked it jumping up repeatedly during the meal, to get the salt that was left on the counter, to bring the thing that was forgotten, to respond to requests from people who are eating while the cook is not. The cook's meal is interrupted and cold while everyone else's is not. The 1954 norm, the meal is complete when it reaches the table, protected the cook's participation in the meal she had made. It required everyone at the table to accept what was there rather than requesting what was missing. This is worth recovering. Not because the 1954 distribution of domestic labor was fair, it was not. But because the principle that the cook's labor ends when the food reaches the table is fair regardless of who the cook is. Tradition 7. The meal lasted approximately 45 minutes. Not 20 minutes, not over an hour. 45 minutes. This was not enforced by a timer. It emerged from the structure. The meal began when everyone was seated. It proceeded through the food at the pace that conversation and attention to the food allowed. It ended when the plates were clear and the breadbasket was empty. 45 minutes was long enough for the satiety signals of the meal to register before anyone was finished eating. The hormonal response to food, the release of leptin and the suppression of ghrelin that tells the brain the stomach is full, takes approximately 20 minutes from the start of eating to begin producing clear signals. A meal that lasts 45 minutes allows those signals to complete their work before the meal is over. A meal that lasts 20 minutes, which is increasingly common in households where people eat quickly in transit or while doing something else, ends before the satiety signaling is complete. The person who ate for 20 minutes often continues eating afterward because the fullness signal has not yet arrived. The 45-minute family dinner was not calibrated to optimize satiety signaling. It lasted 45 minutes because that is how long conversation and shared eating take when people are not in a hurry. The physiological benefit was incidental. It was real. Tradition 6. No reading, no radio, no television at the table. The table was for eating and talking, not for anything else. This was not primarily a rule about screen time. Screens did not exist in the modern sense in 1954. It was a rule about attention. The table required your attention. The food required your attention. The people at the table required your attention. This tradition was not universally followed. There were households where the radio was on, where the newspaper was at the table, where attention wandered. But the norm, the understood standard, was that the table was for the meal. The research on distracted eating, eating while watching something, eating while reading, eating while using a phone, consistently shows that distraction during eating reduces awareness of what is consumed, delays the recognition of satiety, and increases total caloric intake. You eat more when you are not paying attention to eating. The 1954 tradition of the undistracted table was not designed to address this. It was designed to maintain the focus of the meal on the meal. The physiological consequences of that focus were beneficial without anyone intending them to be. Tradition 5. Children were expected to try everything on the plate. Not to like everything. Not to finish everything if they genuinely could not. To try everything. One bite of the green beans. One bite of the turnip. One bite of the thing that was new or unfamiliar or previously disliked. Before any opinion was expressed. before any exception was made. This tradition produced a specific relationship with unfamiliar food. Not necessarily comfort with all food, not necessarily expanded palate, but the basic understanding that trying something unfamiliar before judging it was expected behavior. The modern child who is never required to try something unfamiliar develops a different relationship with unfamiliar food. The relationship that says, "I do not need to try it. I already know I do not like it." That relationship is self-reinforcing and extremely difficult to change in adulthood. The one-bite tradition was not always pleasant for anyone involved. The child resisted. The parent held the line. The resistance was part of the learning. The learning was, your preferences do not exempt you from engaging with what is in front of you. That lesson, delivered at the dinner table 300 times over a childhood, is a different lesson from, your preferences will be accommodated. Both lessons have consequences that extend well beyond food. Tradition 4. Compliments to the cook were expected. Specific compliments. Not the general, "This is great," directed at the food. Directed at the person who made it. "Mom, the gravy is really good tonight." "Grandma, I love how you make the pot roast. The biscuits came out better than last time." These specific acknowledgments, directed at the person, specific to what they made, comparative to previous versions, communicated several things simultaneously. That the work of making the meal was noticed. That the quality varied, and the variation was tracked and appreciated. That the person who cooked was present at the table as someone who had done something, not just as someone who was there. This tradition required attention to what you were eating. You could not make a specific compliment about the gravy if you were not actually tasting the gravy. The tradition required presence, and it rewarded the person whose labor had made the presence possible. It was also a form of feedback that made the next meal better. If the biscuits came out better than last time and someone said so, the cook knew what to repeat. If the pot roast was dry and nobody said anything, and nobody acknowledged the person who spent 4 hours on it, no information was transmitted and no connection was made. The compliment to the cook was a small act of recognition that cost nothing and produced more than its cost in every direction. Tradition 3. The table was cleared and the kitchen was cleaned before anyone left for the evening. Not before anyone went to bed, before anyone left the kitchen for the evening. The dishes went from the table to the sink. The leftovers went into containers and into the refrigerator. The pots and pans were washed. The stove was wiped. The table was cleared and wiped. The kitchen was returned to its baseline state. This was done immediately after the meal, while the family was still in the kitchen, before anyone moved to the living room or the bedroom or anywhere else. It was not a chore that was done later. It was the final act of the meal. The reasoning, rarely articulated but universally practiced, was this: the kitchen that starts the next morning clean is a kitchen that can begin the next day's work immediately. The kitchen that starts the next morning with the previous night's dishes is a kitchen that cannot begin until a debt from yesterday is paid. The psychological effect of waking up to a clean kitchen versus a dirty one is documented in research on morning mood and daily productivity. The 1954 cook who cleaned the kitchen every evening was not thinking about morning mood research. She was thinking about not starting Tuesday with Monday's dishes. The immediate cleanup also prevented the food waste that results from leftovers left on the stove or counter overnight, and the pest problems that result from food residue left in a kitchen. These were practical considerations as much as aesthetic ones. Tradition 2. The table was the place where the day was processed. This one is harder to describe than the others because it was not a visible tradition. It was a function that the dinner table performed without being designed to perform it. For 45 minutes every weeknight, every member of a 1954 American family sat in the same room with nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. They talked. Not because anyone had scheduled a family conversation, because there was literally nothing else to do while you were eating your soup. What came out in those 45 minutes was the day. What happened at school, what the neighbors said, what the father heard at work, what the mother had been managing all day that nobody had asked about, the small things that had been accumulating since breakfast. None of this was therapy. None of it was intentional family connection time. It was conversation that happened because people were together with food and time and nothing competing for their attention. The research on what shared family meals do for children, for their vocabulary development, their academic outcomes, their mental health, their sense of belonging, is by now substantial. The researchers did not find these effects because anyone designed the family dinner to produce them. They found them because the effects were there, accumulated over years of 45-minute Tuesday night dinners waiting to be measured. The dinner table processed the day for the whole family every night without anyone calling it processing. When the table went away, nobody noticed immediately what had been lost. It took the research decades to name it. Tradition 1. The table belonged to everyone, and everyone belonged at it. This is the tradition that contains all the others. The fully set table. The waiting until everyone was seated. The grace, or the moment of acknowledgement. The same food for everyone. The bread basket. The water pitcher. The 45 minutes. The attention. The trying of new things. The compliment to the cook. The cleanup before leaving. The day processed together. Every one of these traditions is a version of the same underlying idea. The meal is shared, and the sharing is the point. Not shared because everyone happened to be eating at the same time. Shared because the structure of the meal made it impossible not to be. The table belonged to everyone in the sense that it required everyone. A table set for 3 with 1 chair empty was not complete. The meal waited for the missing person. The food held in the oven. The siblings dispatched to call whoever was not yet there. Everyone belonged at the table in the sense that the table was where you were expected to be, and where the expectation was honored by everyone showing up. Not because they had to, because that is what you did. It was what the family did. It was what the day required. My grandfather ate dinner at 6 o'clock every single night of his adult life, and everyone was expected to be there. He never described this as a family value or a tradition or a conscious choice about how to raise children. He just said, "That's when dinner is." That clarity, the certainty that there was a time and a place and everyone was expected, is the tradition that built all the others. And it is the one that is hardest to recover once it is gone, because it requires not just a practice, but a shared agreement about what matters. In 1954, the agreement was implicit. Nobody had to make it. It was just dinner. 15 traditions. A fully set table. The waiting. The moment before eating. 1 meal for everyone. The bread basket. The water pitcher. The plan for the leftovers. The cook treated as having completed her work. 45 minutes. No distractions. The expectation that children try everything. The specific compliment. The kitchen cleaned before the evening ended. The day processed together. And the table that belonged to everyone and expected everyone in return. None of these required money. None required special equipment. None required a lifestyle overhaul, or a program, or a book. They required a table, a time, and the agreement that when the time came, everyone would be there. We had that. Most of us grew up at that table, or close enough to it that we know what it looked like. And we know what was lost when it went. Leave a comment below and tell me which one of these 15 you remember most clearly from growing up. The specific tradition that was most present in your household. And if there is one you have managed to keep or bring back, I want to know that too. Like the video if the table you grew up at looked something like this. Subscribe for more of this every day. The kitchen hasn't forgotten. We have.